they change in some way because they are interested in this stuff, or is it just sort of another avenue of interest that really doesn't separate themselves that far from the rest of society?
Yeah, there's always the idealized stories. Oh, there was this complete nerd. He was disabled. He wasn't able to talk to people. You know, he was shy with girls. Whatever. You know, whatever the particular challenge is. And suddenly, through computers, you know, he or she was able to realize themselves. You know, and so people talk about how on the network you don't have to identify yourself. You can be anonymous, so you can really come to your own. I mean, this is just an excuse for growing up, or an excuse for becoming a person. You know, technology happens to do it. It's like saying, well, biotechnology is an amazing thing because with these new strawberries, we'll give farmers jobs that they never had before. So, you know, it would change people's lives if there were something of social relevance behind it. But I think what's happening is that we've finally gotten to the point in industrial culture where new political movements are co-opted before they're even born. And cyberpunk is the first example of that. It's co-opted in the sense that people have this urge to do something new and different and exciting, but it's existing in the exact same group of people that are building the tools, that are selling it for corporations, that are marketing it for people.
Well, it's like Hollywood. Hollywood has that ability too, because by the very nature of what they produce, they produce entertainment, but they also produce advertisement, or the personality of that entertainment.
Right.
And so, and I think the same thing is true with
with advertising. Advertising is like this cool thing, and you see all the neat new aesthetic trends in ads in all places. My God. But that's a secret message. This just in.
I will now be the devil's advocate. No, you're wrong.
Oh, God. Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Okay.
Well, let me finish what I was trying to say, because I think there is a legitimate urge now for things to change. I mean, I think you see it in the way that people are angry at all the politicians and looking for something new. I don't think cyberpunk is it. It'd be hard to isolate a specific political impulse that's behind any of it, other than some vague sense of personal empowerment and decentralization. There's nothing real there. Computers always serve corporations. Even if in a particular instant I can say, okay, I as an individual was empowered by this. I was able to do X, Y, and Z. I was able to write this new program. I was able to break into a bank, whatever. On balance, computers are always going to benefit corporations. Corporations always benefit much more by the very existence of computers than any set of individuals will.
You think so? You don't think that? You don't think if everybody had their PowerBook and their personal modem and their wireless telephone or whatever, that would give them more power in some way as far as maybe, I guess we're talking about spreading democracy, some sort of democratic empowerment thing. I mean, is that all mumbo jumbo, or is there something to that?
Well, there's something to it in the same sense that giving a crumb of bread to a prisoner who's been starving in solitary confinement for weeks will be a feast. So we live in this society that's been completely alienated. We don't have real communities. We aren't able to see each other because we're forced to work 16 hours a day at jobs just to keep even. And so in that environment, if you're given this crumb of community where you can type ASCII text over the line and read somebody else typing ASCII text, wow, it looks great, But it would be much better if we were able to actually reach other people and actually build community instead of buying these corporate substitutions for community.
So again, this is the thing about the way it's been devised as far as how they sell it to you. I guess, so the thing is it sounds like there's a difference between using the technology in any form versus the way we've been sort of where the way it's been shoved down our throats to use it. Is that it, or is it are you not to the point now where you feel like it's just a bad thing? It's better to get rid of it than have to deal with people trying to co-opt it for, like you say, corporate reasons or something, where they sort of spoon feed you a certain way of using the technology, and they sort of funnel you into a lifestyle that's not really going to improve your life, but sort of marginalize it?
Yeah, it's hard to say what the right approach here is. There are a lot of people who are in virtual reality who are advocating what they think are very politically correct things, like telepresence research, which is a big company, Brenda Laurel and Scott Fisher getting together. And their logo is this Aborigine boy diving into a pool. Right. It's this far above the pool. Right. And they, are so, glad that they paid the original Aboriginal photographer for the rights. It's just like, give me a large fucking personal break. It's a big deal. It's not going to do anything for that Aboriginal kid. It's easy to say, oh, well, the tool has been misused, and we, as these heroic designers, have to use it in the right way. Mm-hmm. But I'll say a couple things. First, I'll bet you could go back to the early days of TV and find people saying exactly the same things about TV. Mm-hmm. Something on NPR today about this guy, John Nagy, who gave art lessons. It was one of the first TV shows, and he did it for years. Great, that's uplifting, but look, now you've got Three's Company, excuse me. Second thing is that we have a myth in the society that if there are things going wrong with technology, it's just because it's being misused. It's a tool that we can then take and use right. Mm-hmm. And sometimes a tool is a tool. Like a wrench you can use to fix a car or knock somebody over the head. Right. Sometimes a piece of technology isn't a tool because it depends on so many things for its existence that it forces things to be done certain ways. Example is nuclear power. You and I can't get together with some of our friends and say, hey, let's build a nuclear power plant. It just doesn't work that way. You've got to have a big, giant, centralized utility, this whole mechanism that gets uranium, somehow disposes of the waste, all subsidized by the federal government, and it's a big boondoggle. Computers are somewhere in between those two. It's obviously not as bad as nuclear power. But I think there is an evil there that's insidious because we don't really see it. I won't go into all the details, but a good place to look is this book that Jerry Mander has just come out with called In the Absence of the Sacred, where he kind of goes through chapter and verse how, hey guys, technology is a 500-year dead end. The experiments failed. Computers are, the most visible current means of that experiment. We better think of something else to do. I'm not sure what that is.
Okay. Okay. You mentioned virtual reality. I was going to ask you. How would you characterize? I mean, you sort of went a little bit, but how would you characterize what virtual reality is to most people and what it will bring forth? I mean, they talk about it's endless possibilities, but what does that mean? I mean, what kind of virtues and values does this sort of new future type stuff like virtual reality and telepresence and all this stuff bring to society? What type of things do you think it embraces?
You mean what are people trying to sell it as? Or what do I really think
I mean, even the people that aren't trying to, even the ones that aren't so much trying to make a buck off it, they just see it as their potential for, for altruistic means. I mean, they don't see it, really in the best light. What do they see it as?
Well, I'll say that in a second. The first thing is that all technology is sold to us in the best light. We always get these best case scenarios. Right. Buy a technology, we'll do da-da-da-da-da-da. Nuclear power will be so great, it'll provide us with power too cheap to meter. That's what they told us in the 50s. Right. So with that caveat, what they're saying about virtual reality is that it will let you create worlds of your own, that you can go and communicate with other people, across the globe. You can enjoy these fantasy lives. Then they go into the specific applications for medicine, science, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's fine. You can really, pull people's heartstrings in a phone company advertisement kind of way by imagining some poor crippled kid who can't talk going into virtual reality and being able to run and dance and talk with other kids.
Right. So it's basically, it is like a self-improvement thing. I mean, or an extension of one's ability to communicate and transport themselves to other realities, I guess. I mean...
Yeah, and there's two funny things about that. One is, you hear all this hoopla. Like my dad says, Bubba, what is this virtual reality stuff? Yes, they see it in the paper and everything, but if you look at the actuality of it, it's like, a couple of polygons. It's worse than a cartoon.
Okay. Well, yeah, I just think this thing where they treat it as a discovery, sort of like the Titanic's down there, and all they've seen is like the stern, and they say, "Well, God, the Titanic's there. We know that something this big, right? It's like 1/8 of an inch of the whole ship is there." They say, "Well, if this is what the ship is, then the rest of it must be there." Of course, it'll take us 10 years or 20 years to really make it, so we see the whole thing. But God, whoop-de-doo, we found it. And so it's sort of like versus an invention where it is what it is for what it is today. And of course, you can project things. There is an easy projection to say computers are getting constantly faster and so forth. But it is, and that hype is all important, I guess.
Yeah.
With identifying with it.
I think it's also really interesting just to look at the fact there's so much excitement about it. People are always trying to get people excited about the next technology, but I don't think people are like drooling over CD-ROM the same way they're drooling over virtual reality. There's something about virtual reality that gets people. And I keep wondering what that is. The best I can come up with is that we feel completely trapped in this society. We feel powerless. We look at the world around us going to shit, and we can't think of any way to affect us. Politics is irrelevant. The people are all slime bags like Bill Clinton.
I forgot Clinton. We're gonna hit that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Slime bags like Patrick Cannon.
No, I'm kidding. I wanted Richard Nixon, but that was a joke.
Yeah. So people feel powerless in their lives, and suddenly here comes something offering them escape. Yeah, they haven't really examined it, they don't know if it's real, but it offers them escape, and they go, yeah, I want out. I want a new world, I want a new universe. And to me, that's very sad, because it means that we've given up any kind of vision that we have as a society, that we can effectively change things. To me, virtual reality and the fact that people, the best and the brightest people, are spending so much energy on it, means that as a society we can never even dream of things like building the Golden Gate Bridge, doing a 1939 World's Fair. Those things are beyond our capacity because we've given up power to corporations.
It's like doing an end run when we feel like there's no way to go through it directly.
Well, it's really ironic. It's corporations that are offering it to us. It says, we've eaten your soul. Here's a little crumb. Be happy about it. People go, yeah, virtual reality. Let me in it.
So you think it's all? You think it's all the corporations' fault that this is all happening, or that sounds.
Well, see, of course, corporations depend on these really. On what? I'm sorry.
It's here.
Yeah, corporations depend on the myth of individual inventors. Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak in their garage, the mighty high-tech heroes. Jaron Lanier, the elfin-like interesting theorist, who also plays music, the father of VR. It's like, but defense contractors and the whole 9 yards are waiting in the wings. Same thing happens with any technology. You could go back to the beginning of TV and hear the same kind of hosannas to Lee DeForest and everybody else.
Yeah. Well, it's true. Actually, VR seems to me it was obviously invented partly in the military to begin with. The Link simulators are the predecessors of VR, and it was all aircraft-oriented simulators. Seem like are the forefathers of VR.
Yeah, exactly. Now there are areas like Jaron Lanier's company is not accepting any military contracts, and Brenda Laurel and other theorists are really intent on trying to do good things with it. And that ties into what I was saying earlier, is that it's a self-co-opting trend. Because we've been so brainwashed that we can't truly change society, that the actual geniuses come out and say, oh, this is the new thing. This is all we can do. And they're inspiring. You can get really inspired listening to Brenda Laurel or Jaron Lanier. They're very eloquent in their own way. But I also think they're very misguided. It's kind of sad that so much energy and what would otherwise be really constructive, collaborative work by hundreds of thousands of people is going down a virtual tube.
Virtual tube.
Yeah.
Okay, so sounds like you don't like it that much. Now, is there any?
But I have all this equipment, so what the fuck am I doing? I don't know.
Okay, yeah. So, what is? which seems to be a lot of things. I think a lot of people. I think I have similar feelings.
Yeah.
I feel very enchanted with the technology and very enchanted with its possibilities. Yet, the focus that a lot of people pay attention to, I'm really not interested in. They tend to be, to me, most of my interests in it tend to be very idiosyncratic.
Mm-hmm.
Just quirky, beyond really anything more than that. I was just going to ask you, what are these things that are important for you? What are they interested? How do they interest you? The technology. Is there anything that you've experienced that's been? Given that nothing's 100%, nothing's ever going to be like the hype that it's promoting.
Mm-hmm.
Is there something you found that's been a positive experience out of it, or have you had the virtual reality moment?
That Velox moment.
Exactly.
Well, on a micro level, there's lots of positive experiences. I enjoy, the collaborative environments that often have to take place. It's kind of like making a movie. No one person can do this alone, so you have to work with a lot of different people. On a craft level, when I program or design a particular piece, I get a satisfaction out of seeing that little problem solved well.
Right.
And I'm also doing some experiments in collaboration with other people to see if this can be used as a tool in another way, just as a wrench can be used as another tool, in hopes that this is not something like nuclear power, that it's something like a wrench. For instance, we're doing a piece called TPTV that builds on the ideas in Jerry Mander's book. It's big TP, you go in, there's blankets. You see a monitor where you see animations that are basically ideas from his book, slams against technology. And it's a quick time response system where you see little postcards of people that have been before and you can watch that, or there's a live window and you can leave your own response. And I'm also putting out a floppy disk magazine called Sluggo that will kind of examine these ideas and try and shove some of them back in people's face. I'm not sure those will be successful, but I also don't want to admit that I've wasted so much time in my life, so I'm going to try and make them work. So I have a militant ambiguity towards the whole field. It's fascinating, but I am also fascinated by its dangers.
Okay. Is there a way you could characterize the aesthetics of all this stuff? If you've seen stuff, there's a lot of this stuff also, it's attracted the counterculture in some ways, like the hippies that have gotten bored with drugs or they've gotten taken away from them are now using this stuff because they have some of the sort of creative things that happened before. There's lots of ways people are using it creatively. It's not, I don't want to say that hippies are anything, but...
No, but there are a lot of, and there's so many drug references in this field. I don't imagine if you went into machine tool manufacturing that you'd see so many references in the industry to drugs and creativity. And the question was? I'm sorry.
Let's take a break for a second.
Okay.
Just the aesthetics in computers.
Okay.
I just want to make sure you're still in the field. Good.
Okay.
Okay.
Aesthetics in computers. Well, it's interesting, I think.
And modern technology in general.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that it's just like this has become kind of a self-co-opting social trend. It's kind of becoming a trend that is defining its own aesthetic too, where the aesthetic isn't something that exists outside, like modernism or romanticism, which has been applied to technology.
Right.
The aesthetic is the technology itself. So people are jazzed about the quadras, or they're jazzed about the fact that QuickTime exists.
Right.
There's not any kind of overarching aesthetic that is driving it in a particular direction. It's just what can we build in our labs.
Well, it seems like part of the aesthetic is the technology itself, like these brilliant artisans called programmers that just given us this. It's almost like it's been created, and this is an interesting thing in itself that should be sort of registered as art or something.
Yeah, I think there's another side to that, is that the tools are getting easy enough for people to use that you can apply different aesthetics to it easily. In the first days of computer graphics, it seemed like everything was rotating sparkles or real chrome-looking things like Robert Abel's Sexy Robot. But Now, especially with the wacom pads that are pressure sensitive, you can get real painterly effects and do whatever you want.
Right.
Wait, it was a good one.
Have you? Okay, I can just ask it this way: have you seen any modern any sort of art that would you call really good, that embraced modern technology, but it worked for you? It was good. It wasn't something more than an exercise in playing with the tools.
Yeah, a piece that Sharon Grace did at the Cyberthon conference a year and a half ago was good because it explored these exact issues about technology. You walked into a room and saw a screen in front of you. You sat at a desk with a phone. And when you sat down, the screen went live, and you saw the back of a naked person, and she was talking to you and looking at a screen even further where you were live. So it was as if she was carrying on this phone conversation with you, and then she went on to a spoken piece, and it was really interesting. There's also a couple of filmmakers that are working on this. Rose X is doing a movie called Strange Attractor, which I'll show you the preview of. And they're working on the toaster. And they're actively exploring the concept of techno-animism. Is there some kind of spiritual quality that can be found in this? And that stuff is interesting. But things like Lawnmower Man, like Liquid TV and all the chaos stuff. I mean, it's interesting. It's a technical feat, but as art, it doesn't blow my shit away. But then I'm a jaded cynic, so take that with a grain of salt.
Have you seen Mark Pauline's performances ever? Have you ever seen?
Yeah, those are kind of neat. I mean, they're a little bit too cynical for my taste in a way because I really, I keep looking for things with heart that point to some way out of the current bind.
Right.
And his is a good kind of critique of what's going on because it's such a reflection of the violence and, kind of edgy, jangly feeling that you get in the city.
So it's mostly commentary to you, not much more than that. I mean,
it's good. I mean, he's real technically proficient. It's great stuff. It's not what anybody has done before. And I think it's interesting that it's also outside the bounds of the screen.
Right.
It's not in the computer. And I think that's a real problem, is that these screens are so small. I mean,
and we characterize computers that way.
Yeah.
We characterize that's a computer.
And they call this a desktop. It's like, excuse me, who has a desk that's 12 inches by 9 inches? Nobody. You have to layer all your sheets in one little area.
Actually, all my shit at my desk, my only desktop is right there. It's
I know, it's kind of scary.
There's everything else is.
It'll get interesting when we can have screens the size of a real desk and projections the size of a real desk that people can interact with. But again, that's a technological solution to a technological problem. I'm not sure you could that says anything in particular.
Okay, let's close our eyes for a second. Let's imagine a world.
President Brown. He marries Madonna in the second term. She starts wearing a turtleneck. Everybody starts wearing turtlenecks. Okay. All right. What?
Yeah. I like that. Madonna with a turtleneck. That sounds good.
But it's just a dickie, so you can see cleavage below.
So, okay, let's close our eyes again, but not that far back. Don't close them too tight. Can we imagine someday a future use of this technology where, it seems inevitable that a lot of these machines, unless there's some sort of great poo-ha of religion that becomes a Luddite culture or something, that we're going to have to embrace these things in some way. Can you imagine, other than sort of a 1984 Big Brother or just sort of more spoon-fed scenario, can you imagine uses of, the computer technology in your house and in virtual reality, or is that just too giddy?
Two-way wrist TVs.
Exactly. Is it? Yeah. And it's something with Dick Tracy, but it seems realistic and plausible and not so obtrusive to your brain.
There are tons. Okay. I think there are thousands of individual interesting uses that are going to be found from this. But I think the big picture is more interesting. It's interesting that you mentioned a Luddite response. That's not what I'm trying to engender. I don't think we should all like go out and live in the country.
Right.
Although it'd probably be a good idea if we reconnected with nature, since we're fucking the planet. But I think the positive way to look on all this is not something that should be trashed, but as a monumental challenge to humanity. You know, we've gotten all this stuff that somehow we have to embrace with spirit. We have to inspire technology with humanity rather than letting technology just inspire us and us follow, kind of, following, like, oh well, QuickTime's out, now I'll do digital video. And I think that's entirely possible, but the solution is going to come from someplace outside technology rather than in technology. So, and I can imagine what that will be. Just as I'm sure people inside the ex-Soviet Union couldn't have imagined 2 years ago what their life is like today. I think that level of change is the beginning of a geometric curve of change that is going to blow us away. Our technological culture here in the United States is not going to be immune to that. I mean, I can draw one scenario, but it's probably not true. I mean, imagine a communal culture, building on kind of the cohabitation housing like they're building in Denmark, that makes technology and technological installations a magic thing, just as the shamans, drums, and other implements were once magical tools. Imagine that we would all go down when the time came to manufacture the few remaining petrochemical products we need, to have a ritual at the petrochemical plant. It's painted all in bright Dago colors by the deadhead kids that hang around and paint it all day. I mean, it's crazy. It sounds stupid, but so did saying that the Soviet Union would break up sound stupid 3 years ago. So that's an example of the direction. I'm sure the specifics aren't going to be that. But I have to hold out hope, and that's one direction I hold it.
Well, part of that sounds like embracing technology. I'm not sure if you're saying embrace. That ritual was to a ritual of the deceased or a ritual of embracing it?
Well, it isn't embracing it the way... Technology is done for a reason now. It's done for greed. It's done for short-term gain. People in Wall Street make decisions, and those decisions trickle down through a chain of causal links that goes through 100,000 horrible cubicles to affect each of our lives. We have to regain the power of making that decision, whether it means destroying the corporations, whether it means having a bioregional revolution so that different parts of the country get smaller and break off from the United States. I'm not sure what the specific mechanism will be, but somehow we have to come up with something outside technology that grabs it by the scruff of the neck and says, hey, you do what we want. The challenge is to make it a tool. It's not a tool right now. It's something that drives us.
Wow.
So it's post-Luddite.
So, for instance, the ritual of the oil factory could be a positive thing if it was viewed for what it is. This is a resource that we need badly for our planet to make our culture, the way it exists right now, work.
Right, we'll probably still
Given
want
its shortcomings
plastics like for eyeglass frames or contacts or things like that. We probably won't need it for all the packaging and advertising and useless shit that we use now. But the direction doesn't come from technology, the direction comes from something else. So you don't just worry about what happens at the petrochemical plant, you worry what happens on the social level, and you create a society that recycles, that doesn't screw up the planet, that understands that there's a spirit infusing the planet and all living things that we have to respect. And then these things will become implements, like the shaman's drum. They won't be things that we go enslaved to, or you see bumper stickers on people's car that say, I owe, so off to work I go. It's really time to get beyond it.
Okay, what about smart drugs?
And the smart thing is to figure out why you don't need them. Well, it's interesting. I've been to some of these raves where they've had them, and one of them made me really depressed.
What's rave? Describe rave. That itself is.
It's started in England like about 3 years ago, and it was just like kids establishing this ecstatic Dionysian ritual where they would all go out and literally 40,000 kids dancing all night from midnight to 6 a.m. they'd have a phone network, all call each other and show up on one particular night so that they could kind of escape the police.
Where would they would just go to some anonymous location?
A field out by the intersection of two highways, because it kind of outgrew the club scene because there were so many kids coming. And a lot of it was oriented around LSD and ecstasy, and people would just like blissfully, like dance all night. It's happening here in San Francisco to a certain extent. There's a lot of parties where people dance all night, and there's this thing Toontown, and that's where a lot of the smart drugs are associated with. And it's kind of goofy. I mean, it's fun.
Right.
I mean, any youth movement is going to be goofy because
right.
It's 20-year-old people just kind of having fun. And of course, adults are going to go.
Do you think? I mean, given that there are things we do that we respect as being self-improvement on ourselves, do you think smart drugs is? I mean, of course, there's the hype end of it, and of course, there's the problematic nature of drugs in general. But is there any virtue in having smart drugs as a way of self-improvement or modification? How do you feel about it?
Sure, I think it's there's a certain aspect of it that's good because we have to break out of the Western medicine paradigm of the doctor knows best. We have to learn to take responsibility for our own health and self-improvement, and smart drugs can be a part of that. It can be taken to an extreme, just like going to EST and treating everybody like you're a NEST seminar, or giving up all your life savings to Scientology. But that's not to deny that it can be an aid. I think there are definite effects by it. I think it probably has a bigger effect on our health and mental functioning to exist in cities that are polluted, where we have to breathe all these positive ions that are generated by the pollution. We're under high-stress situations in buildings that have all kinds of formaldehyde and other fumes that affect us. I mean, it's no accident that so many people that we know in the city have colds all the time.
Right.
We're running around like fools with our heads cut off in incredibly unhealthful situations.
So we've already we forced ourselves into a situation where we may have to moderate our bodies differently with drugs that we never considered a natural thing to do, just because we're in an unnatural setting to begin with.
Yeah, it's kind of same thing where doctors say, well, you don't really need megavitamins, but you really do, both because the stresses are so much higher than they were at the time where they did the studies for the minimum daily requirement, and the food we're eating now has much less nutrition than food, because the average piece of food travels 1,200 miles from where it's grown to us. That's completely bogus. Some oranges that they found in the stores have 0 milligrams of vitamin C. And so anybody who says, oh, I get all my vitamin C from oranges, either grows their own or isn't telling the truth.
Do you think, just as far as the self-improvement, just in the aspect of, the virtues of smart drugs are that you are going to become smarter? And I think, that's just there is something more to that. They don't say smarter. There is actual things that they do. Your acetylcholine levels, your neurons will increase their
Right.
firing rate, which in some things is bad. I mean, cocaine will do that, but
Right.
this doesn't do it with such a dramatic effect. Or, do you see that as a positive thing, or is that
Sure.
changing oneself in that way? Starting to somehow physically affect your personality, even if it's not in such a dramatic way as like perhaps become an alcoholic or schizophrenic or something like that. Do you think that's a good thing, or is that a...
Sure, it can be a good thing. I mean, the tabloid press is always going to come up with examples of 13-year-old kids who freaked out and jumped out of windows because of X, and X will usually be a drug. But that doesn't mean that it can't be a good thing. We have to take responsibility for adjusting ourselves, and that not only includes smart drugs, but hallucinogenics as well. LSD and mushrooms may be the smartest drugs there are. It's no accident that all these interesting social trends like raves are happening at the same time that LSD is enjoying a resurgence. There's a real good book by Terence McKenna called Food of the Gods that ascribes the very development of language in humans to the fact that we experimented with psilocybin mushrooms on the plains of Africa. He's also a big proponent of virtual reality, interestingly enough, because he thinks we can construct a visual language in these realms that'll let us talk by icons rather than words.
Yeah.
He has a real good point that it's kind of strange that we have all this bubbling, amazing spiritual stuff going on in our heads, and the way we communicate that to each other is by modulating little mouth noises into these words comprised of letters. It's kind of a weird thing.
Well, everything. Well, yeah, and even some people think that the brain is been. I mean, there's a big debate of whether the brain itself has been the way you think is in terms of words and language, which all developed from vocals originally. So I mean, it's sort of a. I mean, it's one of these things of you wonder if in an evolutionary thought did the language come first to process the brain, or the brain have language to process the language? I mean, did the brain have already the necessary stuff so that it could process language?
Yeah. Plus, I think that we are. There's an interesting point I always like to make on the Turing test. The Turing test says that you'll know that a machine has artificial intelligence if it can fool you that it's a human as it carries on a conversation with you. I'm not sure if I have the wording right, but that's generally it. I think we're approaching the Turing test being solved, but we're approaching it from two directions. In one direction, there's all the artificial intelligence researchers who are actually building smarter and smarter machines. But on the other hand, there's a society that's becoming dumber, becoming more homogenized, and more machine-like because we're regimented every day by the media, by the jobs we work at. And so, you get these people, "Hi, how are you?" And the machine will say back, "Hi, I'm fine." Oh, great! It's a symbiotic bad relationship.
Well, do you think? Well, I mean, do you think it's fair to characterize society as a whole as being that way? Do you think? I mean, do you think? To me, it seems like the aspirations of society are maybe pushing us that way, but I don't know if society itself is that way. I think it's somewhere in the middle.
Well, I don't want to say the opposite. The aspirations are always lofty and idealistic, but the reality is, the people that aren't, somehow victims of the crack culture in the inner cities are working deadening 9-to-5 jobs in corporate cubicles. Nobody's really winning in this situation except the greedy few like Michael Millikan. It's an insane situation. I mean, it has to radically change. I really hope and pray that we'll have just like this massive shift in consciousness in the next 10 years. And that makes me, to sum it all up, I think one of the big things that we have to pay attention to is media. The fact that we have cameras like this in decentralized situations like my little studio here is kind of an amazing thing. Same thing with the Rodney King videotape. We tend to have this mythology of the media being some kind of objective, God that tells us the truth. It kind of, harkens back to the Walter Cronkite day when he was a nice old granddad.
Right, a priesthood of some kind that you would trust.
And now it's just not the case. They're just, they've kind of sunk to this Geraldo, lowest common denominator, and are telling us really idiotic things. And we have to go beyond the media to really create a completely new media structure that exists somewhere outside of the networks that exist today. I think they're an active evil in our land that's encouraging us to be dumb and fuck the planet.
So do you think that's going to rise by creating a subculture of some kind? Do you think it's an organized political movement, or do you think it's going to sort of fall in place by entropy?
Well, no, it's going to take people. It's going to take people taking conscious action. Nothing happens by accident. If we sit back and do nothing, the planet will go to hell. The species will die in 20 years. Bad result. Let's try something different. And I think at its best, that's what the hacker subculture aims at in the cyberpunks, is that they want to create something different. They see themselves as outlaws and pirates going outside the bounds of the system. Oh, excuse me. That was beautiful. It was beautiful. Well, I won't answer that. Just turn off the finger here. Yeah. I'll start over with cyberpunk so you can get a good soundbite. Down, boy.
That's all we're going to catch is that last
sentence. It's nice that you have the same terminology.
Yeah.
I understand.
Yeah, the wrong answer is to do nothing.
Right.
At its best, that's what the hacker subculture is trying to do. These cyberpunks think of themselves as being outside of the bounds of society, as being outlaws, as being pirates, as somehow sneaking around. But excuse me, they're operating on internet, on these giant computer networks set up by the Defense Department.
Right.
What's wrong with this picture? And I think that's my main complaint with the entire cyberpunk culture. It isn't really a culture. It's feeding off the crumbs that trickle down to them from the defense installations, from giant corporations, and from the technological leading edge. That is not where the solution to our problems is going to come from. Nothing that's going to happen that a hacker can do is going to really change the way this country's run.
Do you think they could co-opt it? I mean, do you think they can use what's already there to their own? I mean, so what if they're using internet? But if they end up getting a president in office that wasn't for internet or was for internet and wants to change it, I mean, they've used. Matter of fact, they just used someone else's equipment. They didn't have to buy their own.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's possible. I mean, we all have to carry on kind of guerrilla holding actions like that in order to change things. Just lost it. Yeah, I think it's definitely possible to reuse this stuff. I mean, it's the sea we swim in.
Right.
Technology is not going to go away. You can't ignore it by hiding your head in the sand. But those exact phrases are often used for something that's called crackpot realism. Hey, be realistic. You've got to go along to get along. You've got to get your job in corporations. At the same time that this whole corporate structure is actively destroying the planet. That's crackpot realism. True realism is understanding that that's our current situation, but trying to construct a vision beyond it. And although I think that we'll pick and choose tools from the junkyard of this civilization, and part of those tools will be these technological gizmos that we all know and love. I think that the real work lies in conceptualizing that vision, and that the vision won't grow out of the technology. The technology has to become an organic part of the vision.
Who do you see as anybody? Can you characterize as anybody that is working on that now? Is there any? Do you think artists are helping that out, or do you think? Whose role is that to do that? Is it just? I mean, ideally, it would be every man and woman and child would all get their act together and do that. Do you think it's going to be a case of that, or do you think that someone's going to be pointing the way towards that?
I think different people are going to point the way, and Ice-T is good for pointing the way towards changes that have to happen in the inner city. I think there will be other people for other cultures. I think, interestingly, that we could be very surprised by how much we're going to pay attention to Indians in this country and their struggles. Basically, we're living on their land, and we took it illegally. And it's not something that happened back in the 1800s in cowboy movies. It's something that's still going on today. There are tribes existing who are still trying to live their traditional lifestyles, who have never signed a treaty with the United States and never surrendered, and we're still fucking them over today. A lot of the land that they live on isn't being used by anybody, or isn't lived on. There aren't towns there. They're national forest lands where it's just being sold to timber and mining industries to basically rape. I think we could do a lot by paying attention to them. My fondest hope is that society would somehow, that whites would somehow start listening and say, we've really screwed up. We'll listen to you guys for a while. You take over stewardship of this continent. You take over where we've obviously failed.
That's cool.
Yeah, I'm reading this book now, Indian Country by Peter Matthiessen, where he goes around the country to 10 different areas and describes the land struggles that are going on now. And it's amazing because it blows my mind. I didn't know this was going on, and it's really heartbreaking. I mean, it's just like they buy off the Indians that they can with these massive caste settlements because they're dirt poor. And there's these few traditional Indians that are still practicing the original religion and medicine and everything, and nobody listens to them. They don't have to.
Yeah. It is terrible. I mean, there's only a couple of I know of that have been. I thought it was great in the Blackhawks in New York. The Blackhawks.
Oh, the Mohawks.
The Mohawks.
Yeah, that was great.
That was. I mean, it was amazing. Also, you realize, God, these people are actually. It's like to them, it is their land, and it's not only their land; it's their country within that land. It's their sovereign entities inside this land, and we think of everything that's in our visual domain, everything on this land is completely U.S. and it's completely derived from, it was George Washington's and and everyone before him or after him. And yeah, it was amazing to see them fight for it. And I mean, it was also scary because you realize that ultimately they, you know, if they didn't play their cards right as far as the media attention, it would have quickly ended. But that was, you know, fortunately they did get someone's attention.
Right. Yeah, they could have been wiped out pretty easily.
Well,
So,
God,
yeah,
you're so negative. I wanted to hear about.
Well, no, I'm positive. I have great hope that things will change radically, but I don't think cyberpunk's going to do it.
No.
I mean,
Okay. Well, let's not talk about cyberpunk. Let's talk about technology in general. I guess the thing I'm interested in is finding out if how should people be relating to this technology in general? Should they be actively getting interested in it, or should they be rejecting it all out? I mean, you're saying things that are, you know, on balance, maybe it's a negative thing. Although I know you don't feel that way. I'm saying, but I mean, should your grandmother be interested in computers so that she has a better understanding of idea of what our culture could be like in 5 years, or where a lot of our culture is actually empowered? I mean, we are a technological machine-oriented culture. Our backbone is a machine, and so
for better or worse.
For better, yeah.
Yeah, I think you obviously have to know about it. I think it's important that everybody be informed on this issue because you know, if the Nazi troops are 5 miles outside of your town, you kind of don't want to be surprised if you're Jewish. You know, you figure out a hiding place. But that's kind of like a vocational school answer. Yes, you know, it's great to learn computers because there's going to be a lot of jobs in it.
Right.
But you know, the bigger picture of whether we should embrace this technology as some kind of solution.
No, not as a solution. Well, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, no, what you're going to say.
Well, not as a solution, just as being informed about what it.
Let me turn on the heater. Let me get this tool down.
Did you notice me going?
Yeah, I was getting told.
Let's see how much time. Okay, you got 7 minutes to say the most incredible thing.
Pressure's on.
Since the dawn of time.
Well, let me say my most far out conclusion.
Okay,
of all this.
that's fine.
I think that technology is our particular brand of magic.
Mm-hmm.
I think every culture throughout time has had their magic. You know, the shamans have their trances that they go into, sometimes with the aid of hallucinogenic plants.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the pagan cultures in Europe had, you know, their spells and trances. And we have technology. You always hear kind of apocryphal stories of, you know, African natives saying, oh, the white man has superior magic.
Mm-hmm.
And in some senses, although that's probably just a legend, it may not be that far off. We've managed to develop a weird kind of magic. And here I use magic in the sense that it's something that gives us power over something else.
Uh-huh.
This technological magic has given us power over the earth. We've changed it, we've shaped it, but it's an evil magic, it's a black magic because we've used it without any sense of spirit, without any sense of why we're doing it, of connection with other beings and spirits that might motivate us to positive, beautiful things. We've done it for short-term greed. I mean, you could if you could somehow look inside the mind of every link in a technological chain and take anything, this pen, and you know, take its little parts. Here's some metal. Here's some plastic. Here's the ink. Here's the particular plant where it was all put together, and trace each of those pieces back to its ultimate end. We travel all over the globe to the different plastics factories, to the different paint factories. If you could somehow open up the brain pan of every human who worked on that pen, in any way, whether it's an accountant or a truck driver or a marketer, you still would not be able to find any particular motivation for that beyond a short-term one of making economic profit.
Well, wasn't that all derived from? I mean, do you see? I mean, wasn't economic profit derived at one time from survival?
Sure, yeah.
And
you know, you needed meat, and you happened to be a weaver, and so you had these rugs to trade for cattle.
Right.
And then the barter became complex and abstract, so you came up with money as an abstraction that you could trade instead of having to have the rugs and the cows in the same place. But it's gotten to this crazy thing, and it's increasing all the time. The velocity of money on the foreign exchange has increased 100-fold during the 1980s because of Reagan and his banker ilk. This is wrong. It's like a vortex spinning into the void. What's happened is that there is a whole plane beyond this existence that we've ignored as a society, and we need true magicians to come help us reclaim that plane. What's happening now is that by default, we let evil magicians control our lives, and corporations are quite literally eating our souls. If you think of the word corporation, it's corporate, it's body, and yet corporations are nothing more than an abstract entity. We give power to that abstract entity. We give it life by the fact that we give it so much energy. We go to work there, we take homework and work on weekends, we kick butt for it. In Japan, they wear uniforms for it. And what is Exxon? What is Coca-Cola? Of course, you'll get the answer that they're just ways of organizing economic activity and blah, blah, blah. But because they're so abstract, they've taken on a life of their own. And I think quite literally that's an evil thing. We have to wrest our spiritual lives from the hands of these evil corporations. I know that sounds didactic. I know it sounds crazy, but at some level I think that's the bottom line on what's going on in the world today.
When you talk about corporations, do you see them as a responsibility as a result of some personality, or do you think they just have sort of evolved on their own as an abstract entity? I mean, they have, basically it's a system that's been derived, and the system has thrived. And because of what you've been sort of describing, people have paid money to it. It did good by a lot of people, and definitely the people that are in charge of the system. It's done very well by it.
Yeah, absolutely. The richest 1%, had a great time during the 1980s. All the money trickled up from the poor to them. I think at its outset, you can look at each individual micro decision that led to the state we're in now, and it made a certain kind of sense. But there is such a thing as synergy. There is such a thing as the whole being greater than the sum of the parts. And that's what we're facing now. Joe Blow going to work out at Pac Bell and working in a cubicle is not an evil person. But the fact that there are 1,000 Pac Bells and that everybody works in these situations controlled by it is an evil situation. I'm not sure how to, we have to find our way out of that in the same kind of incremental way that we got ourselves in. Each of us in our own lives has to look to those individual instances where we can declare our independence. And that's necessary. Thomas Jefferson said there had to be revolutions every 20 years, and it's been 200 now. It's long past time. And I've kind of said the word revolution to some of my friends, and I see people getting antsy. It's like, why not? What allegiance do we have to these jobs we go to for now? Well, what is the point? Does anybody really think America is a great country now? I mean, we all get our yellow ribbons out when we win the Gulf War. But then you look at people's response to the politician. Nobody thinks those guys are doing a great job. They're no George Washingtons. They're not even any John Kennedys. Something is really wrong. And we have no role models to change it. We have to start building those role models. Yeah, that's wrong with this picture.
Okay, so...
And what role does technology play in that?
Yeah, well, and I was going to say, my last sort of baited, pointed question to sort of win my agenda.
It's blinking.
What is it?
It's blinking.
Oh.
It's going to explode.
Everyone back! It's probably run over.
I was going to say, where's Waldo?
Yeah, right, that's a Waldo shirt.